Hello, this is Nikki Going. Welcome to our final session, session 10, of our discussions on the Crucible. Today I'm going to teach you how to answer contextual questions on the Crucible. So there are typical types of questions that I'm going to talk you through. I can't talk you through every type of question that you might be asked, but I am going to talk you through the major types and the major skills. So for example, you could be asked to justify, substantiate, prove, give a reason or reasons, or give evidence in a question. You could be asked to critically discuss, evaluate, or comment. You could be asked to account for. You may get a question that requires you to understand or analyze a comparative figure of speech. You may have to discuss, evaluate, or comment on diction, mood, or tone. And a common question that comes up in nearly every paper is discuss, evaluate, comment on, or explain irony. So I'm going to work through these 6 question types today, and hopefully those will give you some these will give you some skills for answering contextual questions on the Crucible. But bear in mind that the skills that you learn here can equally be applied to the questions that you get asked on your novel and in your poetry, in the poetry section of the literature paper, as well as the short questions that you get asked in the language paper and in many of your other subjects. So these are easily transferable skills. Right, so contextual questions on the Crucible. Things that I'm going to cover are the typical types of questions, as I said, 6 typical types, strategies for answering these questions, model answers to the questions, and then some general hints and tips for approaching the literature paper, and particularly the contextual section of the literature paper. So it will probably come as no surprise to you that in order to answer many question types in a contextual exam, and indeed in a language exam, you need to know how to argue. But this isn't argue in the sense of conflict, this is argument in the sense of arguing logically. So remember that a good argument has 3 parts, and I discussed this when we went through the essay writing section of these presentations, but it's a very good idea just to remind you. Always look out for point, evidence, and explanation. Bear in mind that they do not have to be in that order within an argument, but a good argument will always have point, evidence, and explanation. Otherwise, it is not convincing. So an example of a crucible argument is if you were to make the point, Abigail is a cold-hearted sociopath. Now that's just a point. Until you've actually given some sort of evidence and explanation, it's not particularly convincing. And your marker or your reader would probably be thinking, says who? Why should I believe you? So you need to give evidence that's going to back up that point. For example, Abigail drinks blood in order to kill Elizabeth using magic. And now your marker is probably thinking, it's more convincing. I might be able to believe you on that one. But then to really seal the deal and to make your argument absolutely convincing, you need to explain how your evidence proves your point. So you could say something like, only someone with no conscience or empathy would try to murder her lover's wife. So now your marker or your examiner is thinking, I really believe you. That is utterly convincing, and they get their red pen out and they're desperate to give you your 3 marks. Remember, though, that because this is a literature exam, there is very often not only one correct answer. So you shouldn't be looking for what's the one and only correct answer. Answers are correct in a literature paper because you can prove them. So, sorry, excuse me, just get rid of that little box. For example, you could argue the complete opposite. Abigail is just a vulnerable child defending herself. Again, this is just a point. It needs evidence and an explanation to support it. So your marker at this point is probably thinking, but I've just read something where it was argued that she is actually a sociopath. I don't believe you. You've got to give evidence. So here comes the evidence. Those who refused to confess to witchcraft in Salem were killed. For example, Rebecca Nurse. Now your marker's starting to be more convinced. and then you back that up with an explanation. Abigail didn't have an adult's coping skills or Rebecca's moral courage, so she was actually forced into making accusations. And here you can see, because you presented that package of point, evidence, explanation, you have presented a detailed, thorough answer that shows good knowledge of the text and is going to get you your marks. And this technique of point, evidence, explanation is one that you're going to be using over and over and over again in the language paper. And the first 3 skills I'm going to show you focus on how you use this technique for particular question types. But before we get into that, I just want to give you some tips for answering all types of questions within the literature paper. But bear in mind that these tips also apply to your language exam, and they obviously apply to your novel answers as well. So first of all, when you're given the 10 minutes reading time in the exam, read the whole paper. And if you can, try and read the contextual passages twice. Also take note of what's in the contextual passages, even if you've decided that you're going to write the essay on that topic, because you can often get evidence for your essay from the contextual passages. So read everything very carefully. And don't go into an exam with a set idea of which essay you're going to write and which contextual you're going to write. Actually look at the topics and work out where you're going to get the best possible marks. When you start answering the contextual questions, if they're questions that you really, really cannot answer, don't sit there staring at your paper and sweating blood and having a panic attack. Just leave some space on your answer sheet or in your answer booklet if you're writing finals and go on to the next question. If you leave the most difficult questions for last, often by the time you get to the end of the exam, you've got a better understanding, you're calmer, and the answer has somehow come to you. So don't undermine your own confidence by sitting there and sweating over a question you really don't know how to answer. Move on and get the marks you can, and then come back to it right at the end. A golden rule: always, always, always go back to the text. The great thing about an English paper is the questions actually tell you where the answers are. In every question, it will say, refer to paragraph X or refer to line Y. And if you actually go to that paragraph or that line, you will find the answer. So always refer to the given lines. Don't refer to your general knowledge of the text, particularly in a text like the Crucible, because things change throughout the Crucible. And although what you write down may be correct, it may not answer the question because you may be referring to the wrong part of the play if you're just relying on memory and general knowledge. So go back to the passage and check your answer. Before you start answering, highlight or underline the keywords in the question and then include those keywords in your answers, because if you include the keywords from the question in your answers, they act like railway tracks. They stop you from going off the topic, off the question, off on a tangent. Because if you do, again, you might be saying something that is true, that is interesting, but unless it actually answers the question, you're not going to get the marks. So if you embed the keywords from the question in your answer, you're flagging to the examiner that you're actually answering the question and you're helping yourself to stay on topic. Always start your answers with specific words. So, for example, start an answer with John Proctor does X or John Proctor feels Y, not he, because he could be any number of male characters in the play. Don't start with because or so that, because what happens when you do that is your marker has to jump into your thoughts midway and try and figure out what you're trying to say. So it's really important that your answer makes it very clear who you're speaking about, what you're speaking about, and when the events you're referring to actually happened. Because then the marker can locate your answer in the text and understand what it is that you are saying. Now, watch out, because questions sometimes ask you to do more than one thing. So as you answer, reread the question and make sure that you're answering the whole question. A very common error is that students read the first half of a question, they get so excited, they start answering it, and they completely neglect the second half of the question. I think often they just don't see it. So make sure that you've You've read the whole question, you've answered the whole question. Take note of the mark allocation. Remember, you must give one piece of information per mark and decide exactly what information you must give for the mark. And if it is a two-part question, work out where the marks are going to be split. So often two-part questions are for 4 marks, which means that you need to do 2 parts on part A and 2 bits of information for part B. Otherwise, you're not going to get your 4 marks. Even if you wrote 4 things, if you didn't address the second half of the question, you're probably only going to get 2 out of 4. As you write the information that you think is going to earn you each mark, actually tick it off on the question paper. This helps you to make sure that you've actually answered the whole question. It helps you to keep track of where you are in the exam, and it reminds you that you are actually earning your marks, and it builds your confidence as you go along. Remember that the best answers are detailed and specific, and the whole point of a literature or a language exam is to show your understanding. So you need to prove what you're saying throughout. Give evidence. And don't just copy down from the passage, because that doesn't prove you've actually understood. All that proves is that you're actually able to read a line reference and copy accurately. So unless you are actually quoting directly, put things in your own words and demonstrate your understanding. And never ever tell an examiner that they must go and look at line 3 or line 5 or refer to answer 2.6 because I already answered this question and I don't see why I should have to answer it again. That is a sure way to get 0. Okay, remember that examiners don't follow your instructions. They are only going to mark what you put in your answer. And then once you've written your answer, edit it very carefully. Check that what you said is actually what you meant to say, and that the examiner, who may very well be marking at 2 in the morning and utterly exhausted, will actually understand what you're saying. So many types of contextual questions, as I said, will require argument. That's why it's such a valuable skill. So, for example, questions where you need to justify, substantiate, prove, give a reason or reasons, or give evidence are going to require point evidence explanation. So will questions where you need to critically evaluate, discuss, or comment. And definitely questions where you have to account for. And I'm just going to give you a little bit more detail on these. But please note that these are not the only questions where argument is useful. As soon as you get a 3-mark question, usually you're required to argue. It may be a question where you're just required to list 3 pieces of information, but in a matric exam, usually 3 markers and above require argument. They require point evidence explanation. So, the first type, questions where you need to justify, substantiate, prove, give a reason or reasons, or give evidence. Please note that this all means exactly the same thing. It means prove what you are saying by referring to the text. So, for example, in this question, which came out of the DBE 2019 exam paper, you need to actually use PEE. The question is, refer to line 19 to 20. She'll kill me for saying that. Proctor continues towards her. Abby'll charge lechery on you, Mr. Proctor. If you were the director of a production of the Crucible, describe how you would instruct the actress playing Mary Warren to deliver these lines. And then the key word in that question, justify your instructions with reference to both body language and tone. Sorry, there's just a little misprint after the ellipsis, that ... you, Mr. Proctor, please just ignore that. So how would you tackle this? Now, with any question, you must be methodical. Think, then ink. Don't just panic and start writing everything you've ever known about the Crucible ever, because that's very hit and miss and you're unlikely to get your marks. Think first. So reread the question, identify the key words from the question. So the key words were director, deliver these lines, tone, and body language. Okay? You then read the lines in the context of the passage and look for clues that are going to answer this question. Look for clues about Mary's tone and body language. Also remember that this is a play, so you must always imagine what the audience would see and hear on stage. And just take note that these director type questions have come up in every final exams for the last 3 years, so there's a good chance they're going to come up again. Take note of the mark allocation before you start. Remember, 3 marks, you need to say 3 things. And because you're being asked to justify in this question, you need to use point, evidence, and explanation, because the evidence and the explanation is your proof and your explanation of how your proof proves your point. So this is the passage. Mary, in a fearful squeak of a voice, Mr. Proctor, very likely they'll let her come home once they've given proper evidence. Proctor, you're coming to the court with me, Mary. You will tell it in the court. And Mary says, I cannot charge murder on Abigail. And Proctor moves menacingly towards her and says, you will tell the court how that poppet came here and who stuck the needle in. And Mary says, she'll kill me for saying that. But Proctor continues towards her. Mary says, Abby will charge lechery on you, Mr. Proctor. Proctor halts. She's told you? Mary, I have known it, sir. She'll ruin you with it. I know she will. Notice how I've highlighted in red the aspects that suggest tone and body language. And you can do the same thing on your question paper. Proctor hesitates and with a deep hatred of himself says, good, then her saintliness is done with. So, remember the question? If you were a director of a production of The Crucible, describe how you would instruct the actress playing Mary Warren to deliver these lines. Justify your instructions with reference to both body language and tone. 3 marks. So here is just a little breakdown of how you're going to structure this. So you need to make a point, and your point will be the instruction that you will give the actress who's going to play the role of Mary Warren. You need to give evidence. You need to refer to what Miller says that tells you what Mary's body language and tone should be. And then you need to explain why the actress should play the role in this way. You can see your clear point, evidence, explanation structure. And in the model answer that follows, I've used these colors again so you can see the point, evidence, and explanation. So here we go. The point. A director of The Crucible should instruct the actress playing Mary to deliver these lines in a high-pitched, terrified voice while she cowers at her feet, or similar body language that shows fear. I've given you quite a full answer. You would only actually have to make one of these points. Evidence. According to Miller's stage direction, Mary's voice rises to a fearful squeak, or Proctor moves menacingly towards her, or Mary says that Abigail will kill her. Notice how where I've used direct quotes, I have embedded them in a sentence where the context, who said it, when they said it, why they said it, actually makes sense. And then the explanation. It is obvious that Mary is terrified of what Abigail will do if she testifies. Or you could have said Proctor intimidates Mary physically, and so her voice and body language reflect her fear. And you can see in this model answer, I've got point, evidence, explanation. I'm going to get my 3 marks. Now, what follows is the memo from the DBE paper. And again, you can see that they have provided points, evidence, and explanation. So their points. Mary might hold her hands up in a defensive gesture. That's something like this. She might clasp her hands to plead with Proctor. She might fidget, put her hands to her face, step backwards, and her tone might be one of horror, anguish, fear, anxiety, or panic. Evidence. Abigail has already threatened the girls not to speak of the events in the woods. Now we know that from Act 1. And then explanation, and Mary fears Abigail's wrath. Mary knows what Abigail is capable of and is aware that Abigail will turn on her and Proctor if she dares to expose Abigail's lies in court. So if in a final exam you had given any of those points, any of that evidence, any of that explanation, you would have got the marks. And note that they've noted that this isn't actually the only possible answer. They say they will accept valid alternative responses, but your response has to be convincing in context. So you have to refer back to the passage they gave you, and you have to convince them. You need to give evidence and explanation. And they say you will only be awarded the 3 marks if you refer to body language and tone and include a justification. So you can see how point, evidence, explanation translates into this kind of question. Right, moving on. The other type of question you might get is a critically discuss, evaluate, or comment type question. Now here, the language sounds intimidating, and you will get this intimidating language in the DBE papers. So it's important that you understand what these question terms mean. According to the DBE, critically evaluate means give your verdict as to what extent a statement or findings within a piece of research are true, or to what extent you agree with them. Provide evidence taken from a wide range of sources which both agree and contradict an argument. Come to a final conclusion basing your decision on what you judge to be the most important factors, and justify how you have made your choice. Phew, quite overwhelming for 3 marks. So let's see if we can simplify that a little bit, okay? Basically, what you want to do is you want to use P. You want to say, you're going to give a point about how true a statement is, and that's the important bit. You need to say, is this true or not? You need to give evidence to prove your point, and you need to explain how your evidence led to your point. So, critically discuss, evaluate, or comment basically means, how true is this, and why do you think so? Okay, and use P to prove your points. So, if we look at this question, Danforth's refusal to listen to the truth is a sign of cowardice. Critically comment on the extent to which you agree with this statement. This is from the DBE's 2018 lit paper, and it's a 4-marker. So, as always, be methodical. Start by identifying your keywords in the question. And here I came up with Danforth's refusal to listen to truth and cowardice. So remember that your question needs to focus on those 2 elements. Read the line in the context of the passage. Look for evidence that Danforth is refusing to listen to the truth. And then think, why is he refusing to listen to the truth? What's he afraid of? Is he afraid of something? Because if he's not afraid of anything, then you can't really say that he's been cowardly. But you could argue that he's been motivated by something else. Always take note of your mark allocation. You know, 4 marks, you need to say 4 different but relevant things. And because you're being asked to critically comment, you know you need those elements of point, evidence, and explanation. Notice that because this is a critically comment, you can agree that he's refusing to listen to the truth out of cowardice. You can disagree. You can say it's not out of cowardice, it's from something else. Or you can partly agree. You can say it's out of cowardice and something else. But your opinion has to be absolutely clear, and be very, very careful not to contradict yourself, because that is the verbal equivalent of shooting yourself in both feet with an AK-47. So let's look at the passage. Excellency, I would postpone these hangings for a time. That's Paris. And Danforth says, there will be no postponement. And then Paris says, now Mr. Hale's returned, there is hope, I think. For if he bring even one of these to God, that confession surely damns the others in the public eye, and none may doubt more that they are all linked to hell. This way, unconfessed and claiming innocence, doubts are multiplied. Many honest people will weep for them, and our good purpose is lost in their tears. And Danforth, after thinking for a moment, goes to Cheever and says, give me the list. Cheever opens the dispatch case and searches. Paris carries on begging. He says, it cannot be forgot, sir, that when I summoned the congregation for John Proctor's excommunication, there were hardly 30 people come to hear it. That speak a discontent, I think, and Danforth studies the list, and he says again, there will be no postponement. Paris breaks in. Excellency, Danforth interrupts, now, sir, which of these, in your opinion, may be brought to God? I myself will strive with them until dawn. And he hands the list to Paris, who merely glances at it. And Paris says, there is not sufficient time till dawn. I shall do my utmost. Which of them do you have hope for? Sorry, Danforth says that. And Paris, not even glancing at the list now, and in a quavering voice says quietly, Excellency, a dagger. And he chokes up. And Danforth says, what do you say? So, the question, just to remind you, is Danforth's refusal to listen to the truth is a sign of cowardice. Critically comment on the extent to which you agree with this statement, and it's a 4-marker. So, here's a model answer. Notice, again, I've used colors to highlight point, evidence, and explanation for you. So your points. Danforth is scared to listen to the truth about the witchcraft trials being based on false evidence because he is a moral coward. He is afraid to do the right thing. And could have added perhaps that he is afraid of the consequences if he does the right thing. Evidence. Although Paris points out that the people who are to hang are unconfessed and claiming innocence, which means that people will weep for them when they die or see them as martyrs who died unjustly, Danforth still refuses postponement 3 times. Notice I got my evidence from the passage, and I embedded my quotes in a sentence that made sense of them. Your explanation. Danforth should seriously doubt the justice of the hangings. He should question why they have so little support. But he's afraid to appear weak. He's afraid to do anything implying that he's made a mistake or that might damage his reputation as a judge. So he insists that the executions go ahead. And I've put in mark allocations here so you can see that if I had any combination that covered point, evidence, and explanation, as long as I had 4 pieces of information from here, I would get the 4 marks. And if we look at the DBE memo response, again, notice that they also use PEE. So their point, Danforth's refusal to admit that the courts might have been wrong is a sign of cowardice. Because he's afraid of admitting that he's been manipulated and has condemned innocent people. That's a mark. He is unwilling to face and accept the damage that this will cause to his reputation, which needs to be maintained and honored at all costs. That's another mark. Danforth does not have the courage to admit his shortcomings and failings, another mark, and demands respect and unquestioning loyalty to the court, another mark. He's relentless and uncompromising in his desire to see the court's authority upheld, a mark, and thus his status maintained, a mark. Danforth's spinelessness does not allow him to display compassion for or understanding of the plight of the innocents. Yet another mark. So you can see there's, in that evidence, there's loads of potential marks. And then the explanation, he is thus unwilling to acknowledge his weakness and his error in judgment. So you can see from this that you could easily generate 4 marks in response to this question. And then the DBE does recognize that you might have disagreed. So they say the student might argue that rather than cowardice, it's Danforth's obstinacy, his stubbornness, and his concern about his reputation that is at the heart of his refusal to listen to the truth. Evident, and then you would give relevant evidence and you would explain, all right? And again, they say they would give 4 marks for 3 ideas that are well discussed, or 4 ideas. But notice you need the 4 different points and you need the point, evidence, explanation. Sorry, the 4 pieces of information. And you need the point, evidence, explanation. Okay, the third type of question where you will almost definitely use point, evidence, explanation is your account for questions. Now, according to the DBE, account for means that you must give an answer that gives reasons for the subject of the question. If you want to put it in really simple language, whenever you see account for, you can substitute explain why. Okay, so with account for questions, again, you need to make a point about how true a statement is. You need to give evidence that proves your point, and you need to explain how your evidence leads you to your point. So, for example, in the question from the DBE's 2019 lit paper, refer to lines 11 to 13. It cannot be forgot, sir, that when I summoned the congregation for John Proctor's excommunication, there were hardly 30 people come to hear it. Account for the presence of only a few people at Proctor's excommunication. So this is a 3 marker. Again, don't panic. Be methodical. Identify the key words in the questions. Few people, Proctor's excommunication. Read the line in the context of the passage and look for reasons why so few people attended Proctor's excommunication. Take note of the mark allocation before you start. 3 marks means say 3 things. And because you're being asked to account for, you know you need to use point, evidence, explanation. So, just to remind you of the passage, Excellency, I would postpone these hangings for a time, and Danforth goes on and refuses, and then Paris talks about how he hopes that Hale will get people to confess, because if they don't, then doubt is thrown on the courts. He says, These confessions surely will damn the others in the public eye, and none may doubt more that they are all linked to hell. This way, unconfessed and claiming innocence, doubts are multiplied. Many honest people will weep for them, and our good purpose is lost in their tears. And then they discuss trying to get people to confess. And Paris says, "It cannot be forgot, sir, that when I summoned the congregation for John Proctor's excommunication, there were hardly 30 people come to hear it. That speaker discontent, I think, and Danforth again refuses. He says there will be no postponement. Paris, Excellency." And then Danforth again says that they're going to try and get people to confess until dawn. And Paris says, "There is not sufficient time till dawn. And Danforth says, "I shall do my utmost. Which of them do you have hope for?" And then Paris reveals the real reason for his nerves. He says that he found a dagger in his door. And he says that in a quavering voice. So, you want to explain why so few people came to John Proctor's excommunication. All right? So here's a model answer. Notice, again, point, evidence, explanation. The point: Proctor has always had a good reputation in Salem, and he's always been regarded as a pillar of the Salem church and community. Your evidence: Paris points out that the people who are to hang are unconfessed and claiming innocence, which is why the people of Salem disagree that the court's findings that they are witches, or disagree with the court's findings that they are witches. This also means that people will weep for them and that when they die, and that people will see them as martyrs who will die unjustly. So you could have used any of that as evidence. And your explanation: this is also why they do not agree with Proctor being expelled from the Puritan church. Remember that that's the meaning of excommunication. And so most people didn't attend the excommunication ceremony, or the ceremony had very little support. But notice how I have answered the whole question, and I have wrapped my answer in point, evidence, and explanation. The DBE's model answer is the village's absence. They've just paraphrased or put the evidence in their own words. Indicates that they are not in agreement with the decision to excommunicate Proctor. That's the point. And the explanation: the court no longer enjoys the support of the villagers, and its decisions are not popular. The legitimacy of the court is being questioned. The villagers have come to realize that the court is not acting in their best interests. Notice that here we have the three elements of point, evidence, and explanation, but they're not in PEE order, and it really doesn't matter. Sometimes a better answer changes the order. And the DBE says they would award 3 marks for any 2 well-discussed ideas or 3 ideas. And that's straight out of the DBE memo. Right, a fourth type of question is where you need to understand comparative figures of speech. Now, they're not usually phrased in the words comparative figures of speech, but very often you need to actually understand these comparative figures of speech, and the questions will revolve around that understanding. So these questions are based on language techniques where you are using, where you are trying to get your audience or reader to experience a description more vividly. Okay, those are your comparative figures of speech, because most of these techniques are based on comparisons. So it's really important that you know your terms. So I'm just going to give you a quick refresher. Imagery. Imagery is language that's visually descriptive or uses techniques like metaphors and similes to help the audience or reader imagine what's being described. And you could very well get a question where you're asked to discuss imagery. If you don't know what it is, you're going to be in trouble. Figures of speech, you'll remember, are non-literal language techniques that make language more effective or exciting. So you can go through your whole life without using figures of speech, but man, the way you speak will be boring. So examples of figures of speech are things like irony, metaphors, personification, similes. And then it's important that you know the difference between literal language and figurative language. So literal language is language where your words mean exactly what they are saying. So if you say, I am looking for a needle in a haystack, whilst you are actually looking for a needle in a pile of grass, then you are speaking literally. But figurative language is language that relies on comparison for meaning. And very importantly, the words in figurative language don't mean exactly what they say. So if you say, I'm searching for a needle in a haystack, and you're not actually looking for a real needle in a real haystack, it doesn't mean that you're lying or you're speaking rubbish. It means that you're speaking figuratively. And what you're actually saying is that you're looking for something that is incredibly hard to find, because you're comparing that thing that's hard to find to a needle, and the situation in which you're trying to find it to a haystack. Also remember what similes, metaphors, and personifications are. Basically, they are all comparisons, but there's a subtle difference between each type. So a simile is where you compare one thing to another and you use the word like or as. And an example from the Crucible is when Proctor says to Hale in Act 2, were they born this morning as clean as God's fingers? So here he's comparing the witnesses to the witchcraft trials to the holiness and cleanliness and purity of God's fingers. And you notice he uses as. A metaphor is a comparison of one thing to another, where you say one thing actually is another, but you're not speaking literally. So, for example, the little crazy children are jangling the keys of the kingdom of heaven. So here, Proctor is implying to Hale in Act 2 that the little crazy children of Salem are actually performing the role of St. Peter in letting people into heaven or banning them and sending them to hell, because St. Peter held the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Personification is a comparison of something that is not a person to a person, and that's where the word personification comes from. It contains the word person in it. So, for example, Proctor says to Hale in Act 2, common vengeance writes the law. Now, vengeance is an abstract quality. It's the desire for revenge. Vengeance is not a person, but vengeance here is being personified, described as though it is a person who sets out to write laws that are going to get revenge. So, let's have a look at a typical comparative figure of speech question. Refer to lines 31 to 32. We will slide together into our pit. Identify Proctor's state of mind and explain what he means by this statement. So this comes from a Springfield Convent School's mock literature exam paper of September 2020. And before you start, as usual, you need to be methodical. Ask yourself, what two things are being compared? And I cannot emphasize the importance of being methodical enough, because often when people get questions based on similes, metaphors, personifications, they just panic. If you work through this method logically, you should at least be able to get 2 of your 3 marks. One of your marks is going to be for simply saying X is compared to Y. So work out what 2 things are being compared. Then you ask yourself, what do those 2 things have in common? And then, on the basis of that, why does the speaker or author make this comparison? What are they trying to actually say or imply? And then finally, you can ask yourself, am I dealing with a simile, a metaphor, or a personification here? Now, if we look at the passage, you're coming to court with me, Mary. You will tell it in the court. And Mary responds, I cannot charge murder on Abigail. Proctor moves menacingly towards her and says, you will tell the court how that poppet came here and who stuck the needle in. And Mary, shrieks in horror. She says, she'll kill me for saying that. Proctor continues towards her. Mary responds, Abby'll charge lechery on you, Mr. Proctor. Proctor halts and says, she's told you? And Mary says, I have known it, sir. She'll ruin you with it. I know she will. Proctor hesitates and with a deep hatred of himself says, good, then her saintliness is done with. We will slide together into our pit and you will tell the court what you know. So notice that here I highlighted the relevant sections in red, and you could do that on your question paper as well. So what 2 things, so you're going to plan before you start answering. So ask yourself, what 2 things are being compared? Here, the consequences of the court finding out about Proctor's affair with Abigail is being compared to sliding into a pit. What do they have in common? Now, a good way to plan this is to use a Venn diagram. You know those circles you use in maths? Don't actually include the Venn diagram in your answer. Do it on a scrap piece of paper or label it as rough and cross it out afterwards, but visually it helps you to plan. So for example, I could ask myself, what do they have in common? So let's look at the consequences of the court finding out about Proctor and Abigail's affair. Okay, both of them will have damaged reputations. They may suffer physical pain, particularly if the court punishes them. They may be rejected by the community, resulting in loneliness. What do we know about what sliding into a pit, which is a big black hole, would be like? If you're in a pit, people cannot rescue you. You would probably be very lonely. Now, what do these two things have in common? Emotional pain, physical pain, fear, loss of community, loneliness, suffering as though you are actually in hell. And that area in the middle, the common aspects, is what you can now discuss in your answer. So let's have a look. Why is the comparison made? What is the author or speaker trying to say or imply? So Proctor implies that sacrificing his reputation is similar to willingly choosing to slide into a pit, which is a dark hole in the earth, with Abigail. They will get emotionally hurt and possibly physically hurt as well if the court punishes them, and suffer loneliness, isolation, and the loss of their community because their reputations will be destroyed. Now, this is only a 3-marker. You don't need to say all of that. You can choose one of those aspects. So that Venn diagram is just a useful way to plan your answer, but don't actually answer the question by drawing a Venn diagram. And then think very carefully before you write. So ask yourself, am I dealing with a simile, a metaphor, or a personification? And you can work this out by a process of elimination. We can see here that nothing's being compared to a person, so it's not personification. There was no like or as in this comparison, so it's not a simile. Therefore, you must be dealing with a metaphor. So here comes your model answer. As I said, identify the key words, read the line in context, think about how Proctor might be feeling, why he feels this way, think about who the we is that Proctor's talking about, look at your mark allocation. Remember, 3 marks means say 3 things. Okay, so Proctor has decided that he will lose his reputation in order to save Elizabeth's life, so he's resigned in mourning or angry. There's my point. With this metaphor, Proctor implies that sacrificing his reputation is similar to willingly choosing to slide into a pit or a dark hole in the earth with Abigail. Okay, there's my explanation. And further explanation and evidence, they will get emotionally hurt and possibly physically hurt as well if the court punishes them, and they will suffer loneliness, isolation, and the loss of their community because their reputations will be destroyed. So you can see there how, if you are methodical in your approach to comparative figure of speech questions, you can give very full and detailed answers. Another type of question that you may be asked is a diction, mood, or tone question. So these questions are all based on the emotional impact of individual words. But obviously, before you can even start, you need to know what your terms mean. So diction is the choice and use of words or phrases when you speak or write. So a less fancy way of phrasing it is, why did the author choose to use these particular words? Would normally be phrased as comment on the author's choice of diction. Emotive language is language that creates really strong feelings. Think about the kind of language you use when you're having a fight with your parents or your guardians or your boyfriend or your girlfriend. I can guarantee you that you use emotive language. It's language like, I hate you, you never allow me to do anything, etc. Mood is the atmosphere or feeling created by an author or a director, and it can be created by words or it can be created visually. So, for example, if you see a character hunched over and rocking on stage, then it's safe to say that the mood created is ominous. There is a sense of threat or evil. And then depending on what they say, that mood can be enhanced. Tone is very closely linked to mood, but it's not quite the same thing, because tone is only the way that the words or a person's voice is used to express a particular feeling. So tone is all down to language and the way that it is delivered. And again, if you think about when you have a fight with someone you love, your tone could range from angry to pleading to fearful to intimidating. There are a whole lot of different ways that you could deliver your words. So also you need to know the difference between denotation and connotation. Now, denotation is just the literal meaning of words. It's words without taking their cultural or emotional impact into account. So you can also call denotative language objective language. And denotative language is what you would normally find in a dictionary or an encyclopedia. It simply defines things with no emotion. So, for example, if you looked up the word pig in a dictionary, you would get something like a pig is an omnivorous, domesticated mammal, usually farmed for its meat. Connotation is the ideas or feelings that words create, depending on who the audience or the reader is. And obviously, connotative language is going to vary in its impact depending on who's reading or experiencing that language. And that's why connotative language is also called subjective language. So, for example, if you say to a Muslim person, if you ask them what they think about when they hear the word pig, they would probably tell you that pigs are haram, they are unclean. You're not allowed to eat them. A Jewish person would probably also say that pigs are unclean because in Judaism, one is not allowed to eat pork. But a person who has a pig as a pet may actually think of pigs as cute and intelligent. And someone who really, really loves bacon, when they see a pig, they might just get a picture of a burger in their head and start drooling. So you can see that the word pig will have different connotations depending on the audience. And therefore, the word pig can also be a subjective word. So, let's have a look at how you would answer a question that focuses on diction, mood, or tone. Here's an example. Refer to line 3. They've come to overthrow the court, sir. This man is... If you were a director of a production of the Crucible, how would you instruct the actor to deliver this line? Justify your instructions with reference to body language and tone. So notice that diction, mood, and tone questions are often wrapped up in your director questions. And this one comes from the DBE's 2017 lit paper. So, as always, be methodical. Go back to the given text. As you read it, ask yourself how it makes you feel and why it makes you feel that way. Highlight or underline words that create a strong emotional reaction in you and decide what that emotional reaction actually is. Ask yourself, what was the author trying to achieve when he or she included this emotive language? Identify your keywords in your question. For example, in this question, it's the actor that's going to deliver, justify, body language, and tone. And notice that because this is a justify question, you're going to be using PEE again. Take note of the marker allocation before you start. This is a 3 marker. You need to say 3 things. So if we look through the passage, and here I've highlighted the relevant emotive language in red, you can see how you can approach this. So Proctor says, "She never saw no spirits, sir." And Danforth responds with great alarm and surprise to Mary, "Never saw no spirits." And Paris says, "They've come to overthrow the court, sir. This man is..." Danforth responds, "I pray you, Mr. Paris, do you know, Mr. Proctor, that the entire contention of the state in these trials is that the voice of heaven is speaking through the children?" And Mary says, "I know that, sir." And Danforth says, Danforth thinks while he stares at Proctor and then turns to Mary Warren. "And you, Mary Warren, how came you to cry out people for sending their spirits against you?" And Mary says, "It were pretense, sir." And Danforth says, "I cannot hear you." And Proctor says, "It were pretense," she says. So, you want to look for words that have strong emotive connotations, words that are emotive, and then start answering your question. So, the actor playing Paris should look and sound scared and angry. There's your point. Paris can see that Danforth is alarmed and surprised by Proctor's statement that Mary and the girls never saw no spirits. Notice I've embedded my evidence in a sentence. Paris knows that the court and his own power depend on Abigail and the girl's testimony and their reputations as honest, reliable witnesses. So he'd probably shout this line and throw his hands up in horror while moving angrily towards Proctor. There's my explanation. And the DBE's model answer, memo response, is Paris might look anxious and frustrated or angry. He might stand with his hands on his hips and then point to Proctor, or he might have both arms outstretched in exasperation. His tone could be one of righteous indignation, or he could sound panic-stricken and defensive. And then they follow that with some explanation and then some evidence. At this unwarranted interference by Proctor, he's concerned that if the court is overthrown, the overthrown is the evidence, he will lose credibility and his reputation will be tarnished. So notice here we've got point, explanation, evidence, explanation. It doesn't matter. You have got all three elements of point, evidence, and explanation. And the DBE goes on to say, accept valid alternative responses. So this isn't the only response. The candidate's response must be convincing in context, and you would only get 3 marks if you talked about body language, tone, and included a justification, i.e. they're looking for argument, PEE. Right. The last type of question that we're going to address is irony questions. And these questions are based on your understanding of irony and your ability to explain irony. So again, you need to know your terms. If you don't know your terms, going into literature or a language paper is like going into a maths exam and wondering what all those little crosses are on the page and those funny little stripes and dots. You know, if you don't know what plus, minus, divide, and multiply are, you're doomed. It's the same thing in a literature and language paper. Know your terms. So irony is when the meaning of a person's words are the opposite to what they're actually saying, and it can be deliberate or accidental. So, for example, if I was to tell you this studio is completely safe whilst the screen behind me was on fire, that would be ironic because what I'm saying would be contradicted by the situation. Or if I said something like, you don't need to know your language terms, and then went on and marked your paper and failed you because you didn't know your language terms, that would be ironic because what I said would be contradicted by what I clearly meant when I went and marked your paper. Sarcasm is similar to irony, but it is the use of irony to mock or to cause hurt. And paradox is a statement that sounds like it's absurd, it sounds like it's probably contradictory, completely illogical and untrue, but when you examine it carefully, it actually tells a greater truth. So you can see that in any question where you're asked to talk about irony, sarcasm, or paradox, you're looking for an element of contradiction. With these questions, it's important that you're methodical. So if we look at the question, explain the irony of Danforth's assertion that it is the voice of heaven in line 5 speaking through the voice of the children in line 6. This question came from the DBE's 2017 literature paper. You need to unpack it very, very carefully. So go back to the given text. Always go back to the given text. As you read, look for that element of contradiction. You're looking for opposing ideas. Is anything said by the characters that's the opposite of what is actually true? Highlight or underline those words where you think there is a contradiction, those words that you find it difficult to trust. Ask yourself why you feel like this about those words. Identify your keywords in the question. Here they would be irony, voice of heaven, and the children. Notice that you're going to use PEE to answer this question, and if you do, you're definitely going to write enough for your 3 marks. And again, take note of your mark allocation. 3 marks, say 3 things. So in the passages, Proctor says, she never saw no spirits, sir. And Danforth responds with alarm and surprise to Mary, never saw no spirits. And Paris squawks, they've come to overthrow the court, sir. This man is. And Danforth interrupts him, I pray you, Mr. Paris. And then he rounds on Proctor. Do you know, Mr. Proctor, that the entire contention of the state in these trials is that the voice of heaven is speaking through the children? And Mary says, I know that, sir. And Danforth thinks and then stares at Proctor and turns to Mary Warren and says, and you, Mary Warren, how came you to cry out against people for sending their spirits against you? And Mary says, it were pretense, sir. Danforth, I cannot hear you. Proctor, it were pretense, she says. Now, if I read that carefully, I'm asking myself, voice of heaven? Abigail? Is she really godly and good and honest? Which is what the voice of heaven implies. And bam, I've got my irony. So, let's look at a model answer. It is ironic that Danforth says that the children speak with the voice of heaven, because this implies that they are good, honest, and on the side of God. There's my point. Evidence. The audience knows that Abigail has been lying in order to get her enemies hanged, or audience knows that Abigail is falsely accusing Elizabeth Proctor of witchcraft so that she, Abigail, can take Elizabeth's place as John Proctor's wife. Either one of those would get you a mark. And then the explanation, this implies that the voice of Abigail and the girls is not actually heavenly, but is evil, dishonest, and murderous. So you can see I've got my 3 parts, point, evidence, explanation, and I've got my 3 marks. The DBE's model response is the girls appear to be helping to root out evil in Salem by offering the names of so-called witches. There's your point. However, here comes the contradiction, the but, the irony. The girls know that there are no witches in Salem and that the people they are accusing are innocent. There's your evidence and your explanation. The girls are in fact the perpetrators of evil and they cannot be considered to represent heaven. There's your explanation. So boom, one piece of information, second piece of information, third piece of information, 3 marks. Thank you for playing. Okay, and the DBE says award 3 marks only if irony is discussed. So they want to see from your answer that you know what irony is and you've picked up on that element of contradiction. And note that, as I said, you've got PEE throughout. Now, some final tips. Once you have written your answer to any question, you need to check a whole lot of things. Firstly, does your answer answer the whole question? Will the marker understand what you have written? Have you edited spelling and grammar and checked that you are writing in full sentences? Because that helps the marker to understand what you've written. And I think quite a useful technique here is to picture that your marker is not a highly educated teacher. Picture that your marker is maybe someone in grade 8. Have you explained this so well and so clearly that a 12-year-old would actually understand what you're saying? And if you haven't, you need to do a bit of editing. Ask yourself, is your work neatly presented? Now, don't run out of time on your exam because you're trying to produce perfect copperplate handwriting, but make sure that your writing is at least legible. Can the marker read it? Don't write and then rewrite all your answers because you'll run out of time. But if you need to cross something out, a single neat line and then put the correct word in above it, not a vendetta where you're going and scribbling everything out, because that really has a bad effect on your marker. Did you put your evidence in context? In other words, did you say when you gave evidence who was speaking, what the event was, when and where and why it happened? And if you used a quote, did you put it in a sentence that actually makes it make sense, which is what embedding quotes is? Have you used formal academic English? So you should not be using the word you or I anywhere in a literature paper unless you are quoting directly. You should not be using slang or colloquialism. So don't give answers like, your John Proctor is a raging idiot. If he was my man, I'd clap him do it. You may feel like that. It may be very, very true, but it's not the correct language for a language paper. So you would phrase that as something like, John Proctor is not a good husband because he commits adultery, and Elizabeth is justifiably angry with him. Make sure that you've written in the literary present. Now that's just posh for you should usually be writing in the present tense. So you should be phrasing things as though they are happening now, unless it doesn't make sense. You know, if it really doesn't make sense to write in the present tense, then you can write in the past. Check your answers are numbered correctly. Now, sometimes you will do answers out of order. Maybe you skipped a question, you ran out of space. It doesn't matter. But if you do your answers out of order, renumber the answers and check that you've actually highlighted the different answer numbers so that the examiner can see them. Make it very, very clear to the examiner that you've answered in a different order. And then it generally isn't a problem. And check that you've actually answered your questions correctly. So all that remains for me to say is lots and lots of luck with your matric exams. I hope that the Crucible doesn't turn out to be the trial that it was for the people of Salem, that you are not burnt in a hot fire, and that you actually earn all the marks that you deserve because of the hard work that you have done. And I hope that you've enjoyed these presentations and that they are useful to you. Thank you very much.